Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
50 years ago, the 20th of April, 1968, in a hotel in central Birmingham, Enoch Powell, already a very prominent political figure in this country, gave a speech that was, without doubt, the most divisive speech that's been given in this country in my lifetime. As I was growing up, he was a name that was constantly discussed, and when you heard the name, some people recoiled in horror and said that he'd done huge damage to race relations in this country and made life uncomfortable for many black people. Others thought he was an absolute hero who dared to speak out against the establishment. So he was this hugely divisive figure. And I want to know, what you, as an individual, take from that speech. And if you think it was totally wrong, please call me on 0345 6060 973. Or maybe you think, the language was pretty extreme, but he did give some warnings about what would happen if we did not get integration right in this country, in which case text to 84850. And any other thoughts on Powell, his legacy? Did, in some ways, Powell's arguments have an influence over our recent Brexit referendum? Let me know what you think. You can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course, as ever, you can watch us on Facebook Live and comment there too. Well, to help me with this and to get some perspective on who Powell was, because unless you're over 50, you probably don't really remember Enoch Powell being a public figure. But boy, he was a huge public figure for many, many years. To help me with this, I've got today Sir Anthony Seldon, political historian, who's written biographies of John Major, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, and is the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham. Good morning, Sir Anthony.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. Tell us, just imagine for a moment, Sir Anthony, that you're talking to people under the age of 50. Who was Enoch Powell and what was his significance?
Imagine an incredibly brilliant politician. Here was somebody who was the youngest brigadier in the British Army, who was also a brilliant scholar, one of the youngest professors ever in university history, and an astonishing politician who was well known for his rhetoric and for his sharpness of mind. And then in 1968, he made this speech, which, as you say, rewrote the history books. And he rewrote the history books not because of so much what he said, but the way he said it. And he used imagery that didn't so much draw attention to a concern, but inflamed people on both sides. So that in brief is the Enoch Powell potted history.
Yeah, and he now this particular speech, he kind of knew, I think, what he was getting into. Let's just listen, Sir Anthony, to what Powell said very early on in that speech.
I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation?
So he knew, Sir Anthony, what he was doing, didn't he?
He absolutely knew what he was doing. He talked about setting up a rocket that would change everything, and this rocket wouldn't come down. It would keep up there, and the world would be forever different.
And in a sense, because of this speech and the phraseology that he used, that a constituent had said to him that the black man would hold the whip hand over the white man, and then of course it's known as the Rivers of Blood speech. As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding like the Roman. I seem to see the River Tiber foaming with much blood. Did he realise, though, that by saying these things he would actually become a political outcast?
I don't expect that he thought he would be forever a marginal figure in British politics thereafter. He was very ambitious. He had desires to get to the highest office. Having said this, the then Tory leader, Ted Heath, sacked him, and he never again held office in the Tory party, and he broke away and became a maverick for the rest of his life. But, the issue, I think, is that many people in many countries worry about the balance of immigration, and too many too quickly can upset the delicate balance in society. Now many reasonable people accept that is a concern, and it was the way that he said it, the highly emotive language, rivers of blood flowing through the streets. It was deliberately incendiary on his part. He thought it was drawing attention to something that he thought politicians were not giving him sufficient creed to, but it hasn't happened. Britain has been a successful multicultural country. There hasn't been the open clashes that he foresaw, and had he made his point in a less emotive way, he might have drawn attention to it in a more reasonable way that would have got decent people of all parties looking at the right rate and the right rate of integration to keep a good balance in society. But he didn't do that, and I think you could say that he caused damage not just to his own career, but to the case that he was making.
Well, I felt this because when I started talking about immigration, when we opened up the doors to 8 and then 10 former communist countries, I found arguments that I was making about numbers, integration, arguments that I believed were wholly logical and rational arguments, actually, to even touch on the subject, I was sort of shouted down as if I dared to do something that was wrong and was bad. And I do wonder, on this question of immigration, whether Powell didn't actually make it harder for people to talk about the very thing that he wanted highlighted.
Well, it's very hard to know the answer whether he did or not. He certainly inflamed the issue, and I think the fact he showed no contrition afterwards did further damage to his cause. He is known to have said that his one regret was not making the speech, but that he didn't quote Virgil, the Latin writer, in the original Latin rather than in English, which is a very sort of flip thing to have said. So he quite possibly did polarize, and having a polarized society is never helpful for logical debate. I mean, there are reasonable people on both sides of this issue, and to respect what the other side says and to listen to the other side and come out with a reasonable way forward would have been a much better way. And it, as you said, Nigel, the country's been changed since because of this extraordinary speech.
Did he make life more difficult for black people living in Britain in 1968?
Well, I would think he did, because he had very large numbers of supporters. There were protests in his favour, and as an integrationist, I can't support that at all. I'm the child of immigrant parents. My grandparents were immigrants, and I think that this was not a reasonable thing to have said. And it is important in issues that are highly sensitive. So capital punishment is another. It's highly important for politicians to be temperate in the points that they are making. We could see this again over the whole issue of Brexit, where intemperate language was used on both sides. The public deserve and need politicians to be reasoned with them, and if they are themselves going to resort to the language of the street and the pub, they kind of legitimize that, and it doesn't help clarity to emerge.
Yeah, and yet he was this enormously civilized person as well, wasn't he? And
this is a very great paradox, Nigel. He was incredibly learned. He was not a...
He loved music, didn't he? And
he loved music, mind you. To lots of fascists, but he was a very cultured person, and was a very cultured family man, had a lot of friends.
And quite liberal, Sir Anthony, wasn't he? Quite liberal on social issues.
Well, he was very liberal. He was very liberal on social issues, very liberal on economic issues in the sense of being very extraordinarily pro-free market. So he was one of those cases, if you like, one of these very brilliant mavericks who somehow just didn't fit in and who felt never understood by the establishment, was outcast, and that can happen to these people, and sometimes one feels what one's left with politics for those people who are more conventional minded, but one can understand why that is, because they're saying things that seem to ordinary people to be much more acceptable. So there you are.
No, thank you very much, Sir Anthony Selden, for talking us through Powell. And as Sir Anthony says, he was an utterly brilliant man in so many ways. And for me, I was a big supporter of Powell. I was a big supporter of what he stood for in terms of economics. He was a monetarist before Milton Friedman. He was a monetarist before Margaret Thatcher had even thought about this stuff. And on the European question, he was wholly opposed to us joining the common market. He maintained that view for the whole of his life. In fact, he and Tony Benn were the people that I listened to and looked to and thought about their words before I got involved in politics myself. And in a minute, I'll tell you about a very interesting personal reminiscence of myself and Enoch Powell. But for now, you're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show exclusively on LBC, and it's 11:15. Enoch Powell's speech of 1968 says things that are important. He talks about integration. He talks about numbers, controlling immigration being the right thing to do to have an integrated society. He makes predictions about what the numbers will be in this country by the year 2000 that proved to be remarkably accurate. There were really important things that Powell was trying to say in this speech, but he'd tried a few months before in Walsall. He'd given the same speech, and it hadn't really become the big issue that he thought it would be. So this time, he decided he would use language that would get it onto the front pages, and that's why, we played that clip earlier. Even now I can hear the howls of execration. How could I say such a horrible thing? He knew what he was doing, but at the end, when he uses this classical analogy about the Romans standing on the banks of the River Tiber, I think he just assumed that everybody would have read the Aeneid and would have understand what he was going to do. I think that the violence of his language damaged his case, damaged his career, to the extent that he was only ever an outsider from that moment on, when had he not given the speech using those words, I think he would have become the Prime Minister. I really do think he would have succeeded Heath and not Thatcher. But he also made it very difficult to have a rational, open debate about immigration for all the decades to come. And I know that, I think, probably more than anybody living in this country today. I was trying to talk about opening up the doors and being sensible and having control. And as soon as you did it, you were cast into this bracket. You're a Powellite, and therefore much hate must be directed at you. But despite all of those things, despite my criticisms of that speech, I'm a Powell fan, make no bones about it. And what he said about the European Union was right. I chauffeured Enoch Powell to his last ever public engagement. It was at Newbury Racecourse back in 1992. He sat in the front, the wartime brigadier, and as we arrived at the gates, there were some communist protesters who smashed the back of my car in with a big wooden stave. I was absolutely shaking like a leaf driving this car, not knowing what to do. But the wartime brigadier, talk about stiff upper lip, was completely unmoved by all of it. So I did meet him. I met him several times, and he was, for me, an inspirational figure when it came to the need for our country to be a self-governing, independent nation. So that's where I am on this, but I'm critical of the language that was used in this speech. Lots of emotion out there. Steve in London says, Powell insulted the British public by assuming that all Britons were half-wit racists. He was wrong, not brilliant. But Mark in Oxford says, Enoch was right. The attempt to forcibly integrate disparate cultures won't work. And that Enoch was right, Enoch was wrong argument, we still hear it being talked about today. Manjit is calling from Peterborough. Good morning.
Morning, Nigel. There's Manjit.
Manjit. Right, now tell me, Powell's speech, what does it mean? Was it a very divisive thing for the ethnic communities to listen to this?
Right. Okay, I was 9 years old. I'm a British-born Sikh first generation now with children second and third generation.
Yep.
And I remember the shockwaves it caused. I was too young to understand. But in the Asian community, we were told, don't go out of the house, don't go to school, mum, don't go to town, we'll be deported any minute, there'll be gangs on the streets roaming for us. So it did send shockwaves in the Asian community. However, he never mentioned Asians. He was on about the black community rather than the Asians. But the ironic thing was, he was actually liked by the Asian community, Enoch Powell, because he had a great affiliation with India.
He loved India, didn't he?
He loved India. He was fluent in Urdu, Punjabi. He knew about Sikhism. He knew about Islam. He knew about Buddhism. He ate curry 3 times a week. He was so much liked until this speech came out. So there's quite a paradox there with what he said and what happened, you know. And that's what was so hard for the Asian community at the time to understand. But the way he said it, and at the time, you've got to take into consideration. And I think the Rivers of Blood speech, what he made was, he was there, and he wasn't a racist. I don't believe he was a racist, unlike Mrs. Alibi Brown, who was on Ian's show a few days ago, you know, which I don't know why you get that woman on anyway. But anyway,
we've all got different opinions, you know, and she's never scared of expressing hers.
Yeah, but her opinion is the only one that matters for the Asian community. I don't think she represents the Asian community. Sorry, to get back to the Rivers of Blood speech.
Yeah.
Powell was in India during partition. Unfortunately, the British caused a partition, and he saw communities turn on communities, and there was mass slaughter.
It scared him, didn't it?
Both sides.
Yep.
He saw that. He witnessed that. He was there. And I think that what he's trying to bring over here to say, look, I don't want this to happen over here. I don't want communities to turn on one community or two communities to turn on each other. So he was trying to maybe pre-warn or preempt or whatever he was trying to do. I think that's where the Rivers of Blood came into it, sort of thing, you know. So
yeah.
He was a contradictive man, but in some aspects he was right.
And your parents, you know, as first generation migrants living in Britain, I mean, what did they think at the time?
Well, my father actually liked Powell because he remembered him from India, and he said there's a famous story that Enoch Powell refused to go into an officer's mess because his captain, who was an Indian, wasn't allowed to come into a British officer's mess.
Right.
And he refused to go in. He said, I'm not going to go. If my captain cannot come in with me, I will not go in. And he refused to go in there. So I don't know where the racism comes in. You know, he was a complex man. His language was inflammatory, yes, but sometimes when you want to get your message across, you have to...
Well, that's exactly what Powell was trying to do, wasn't it? He was trying to get his message heard. But, you know, when he used phrases like match to gunpowder and rivers of blood, he went over the top. Great call. Thank you very much indeed. Really, and this is interesting. Powell did love India, and he used to broadcast on the BBC World Service in Urdu. So he learnt the Indian languages, he loved the culture, and as we've just heard, he had curry 3 times a week. Terry from Worthing says, it says something that a speech made 50 years ago by a man who left politics 31 years ago and who died 21 years ago is still being discussed. Well, Terry, the reason it's still being discussed is many of those big themes, the big themes that Powell talked about, government borrowing, EU membership, migration controls, many of those themes are still being discussed today with much the same urgency they were back in 1968. James is calling from Barnes. Good morning, James.
Oh, good morning, Nigel. Yes. Well, following the last call, he made a lot of the gentleman before made a lot of the points I was going to make. I actually was visiting Wolverhampton quite regularly at the time, and my family knew him very well, and. There's a story behind this. I mean, he was a great friend, as has been said, of the Sikh community, but at that time, there was a political movement for turbans to be worn rather than the standard uniform on the Wolverhampton buses. And I know this sounds a bit perhaps a bit of an aside, but it was actually very central because...
Well, no, James, actually today we discuss face coverings and say these are very similar arguments in a way, aren't they?
Point was that it was coming to the very core of two things that Powell stood for. Enoch Powell was a great believer in British national identity, and he was very afraid that we were going to have this multicultural identities, which he saw, as the gentleman has said just previously, that this would foster abrasion between the races, and he had seen, the rivers of blood thing. He'd actually, not actually, the experience that had happened in partition was rivers of blood.
Yeah.
And he was desperately afraid that we were going to get a lot of friction between different identities, cultural identities, which would cause havoc in the future.
And of course, he also, James, at the time, was witnessing some of the disturbances taking place in America.
Well, yes, of course. All these things were the thing. But I mean, the point was that the great thing about Enoch Powell was he was first and foremost, people say he's a career man. He was a constituency MP first and foremost, absolutely. And he had a great following. And the man who actually, this is very, very interesting actually, the man who actually started off the political protest about the turbans in Wolverhampton was a friend of his. Turned out, and Enoch Powell actually got his son over here, and he said very recently, he said Enoch Powell was most definitely not a racist.
Yeah, a lot of people who knew him say that, and yet for those that don't know him, as I say, you mention his name and they recoil with horror and say that he was racist and bigoted and all the rest of it. James, thank you for your insight. Great call. Floyd is calling from Romford. Good morning, Floyd.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm well. So, Powell, 50 years on, right or wrong? What does he mean to you?
Well, it's interesting. I'm born and bred in Wolverhampton. I'm of Afro-Caribbean origin. I'm also a political scientist as well, to throw that in. And it's very interesting because there's a story that no one knows, that very few people know. Nearly every Sunday or every other Sunday, Enoch Powell used to go to a Jamaican lady's home for dinner. He was very, very close to quite a number of people in the African Caribbean community. And obviously his speech had massive repercussions. I was born in 1968, so clearly I don't remember it. But I know, in fact, I was speaking to my mother about 3 weeks ago about Enoch. I was in Wolverhampton. Yeah. And she was just telling me, Sundays he used to go to this particular lady's home, the grandmom of a friend of mine, for dinner. And they were very, very close. They lived very, very well together. And then when the speech came out, and the years following after that, there was obviously some division in terms of their relationship. But prior to that, they were very, very close. They lived almost like brothers.
Those that say, Floyd, those that say Powell's a racist, etc., don't actually know the man. He wasn't a racist. You're absolutely right about that. But what he feared was large-scale immigration and a clash of cultures. That was what he was scared of, wasn't he?
That's right. And I think that the point that you made earlier is informative because also one of your callers that politicians need to use temperate language, because if they begin to use the language of the streets, it then legitimizes caustic and coarse language and behaviours, and that's the problem that he caused.
So ultimately, Floyd, a very clever man, but a man who made a big mistake here.
A huge mistake.
I couldn't agree more. Floyd, thank you very much indeed for your calls. Some very interesting thoughts and insights there from people who were in and around Wolverhampton at the time. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on RBC. It is now 11:30. And was Enoch Powell right or wrong when he gave that speech 50 years ago? And what does it mean today? And I'm getting plenty of you now coming on saying that he got it wrong and it was bad what he said. But before we go back to that, let's go down to Tower Bridge, where LBC's reporter Chris Golds is there. What's happening at Tower Bridge, Chris?
Morning, Nigel.
Morning.
Well, as I'm sure you can hear...
Well, we were...
Quite literally hundreds of runners here as they... Hello, Nigel?
Yeah, I can hear you. Well, it sounds like the LBC's reporter is being overwhelmed by sound.
Yeah, thousands of people here cheering on spectators.
We're going to have to come back to Chris Golds. It all sounds terribly exciting down there at Tower Bridge, doesn't it? 41,000 people taking part in the London Marathon on what's going to be the hottest ever London Marathon. The noise, the crowd sounded quite extraordinary. Let's go to John in Hackney. John, good morning.
Hi, Nigel. I'm a first-time caller.
Well,
Very
welcome.
nervous.
Welcome. Well, John, I promise you, people say nervous. Actually, it's just like having a chat with somebody. Now, I've made these points, John, that I don't believe Powell was a racist as an individual, but I can see why. I can see why the speech did cause offence to a lot of black people.
Absolutely. I mean, a couple of things. So the words used, he's talking about black people. He's talking about whip hand. Those two words invoke, slavery, things that happened then, and things may be turned back on white people, and black people may start to do what happened to them. That's the kind of thoughts that it kind of conjured up for people, I feel.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't understand how people can say he's not racist if he's talking about black people in that way. You've got Indian people calling up and saying, "Oh, he wasn't a racist. We used to like him before that, etc." But if you're talking about you're going to be overflooded by black people and inciting such rage and fear amongst white people, this is racism. I mean, you couldn't get away with this today.
The trick that he used, John, was he said that a lot of constituents had been writing to him or had been meeting him. And so what he was doing is he was quoting the constituent. So it was a constituent that said to him, that he feared that in 15 to 20 years' time, the black man would have the whip hand over the white man. So Powell was saying, I'm not saying it, but my constituent did, and we can't ignore the fact that people feel like this. I think you're right. I think you're right. When you say, John, you wouldn't get away with it today, I think that's probably true.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, I was like a child in the 70s, and towards the late 70s, I remember being in Stoke Newington, walking down Lordship Road, with my shorts, cars driving by, shouting at nigger and spitting at me, and me having to run all the way home at like 8, 9 years old, and seeing NF logo sprayed across Hackney. But at that time, I didn't know anything about it.
Okay, well, that's...
Now, obviously, it makes sense to me.
Careful what words we use here, John, but no. But that wasn't... I mean, do you think that sort of thing that was being shouted at you was happening because of Enoch Powell, or is what Enoch Powell did in 68 to alert people to the fact that there are people feeling like this, and that if immigration's not controlled, it could get worse?
Those things were happening to me and other people like me because of fear, because of just not knowing, the African Caribbean community, etc. But it was incited and, petrol thrown on the flames by people that people respected. Like you said, he was a brigadier, he was very learned, very cultured. And if he can say things like that, then to the people who are not as cultured and learned as him, it's like, okay, we're right in what we're thinking. So it is right for us to do that. And then to add as well, at that time, I'm sitting at home watching Roots on TV as well. And I'm sure the racist, bigoted people watching that as well. So with all of these things all coming together around the same time, within the same decade, etc., it just is... Okay,
so John...
Absolutely...
John, yeah, I mean, the way you describe it...
Dangerous.
The way you describe it is you feel that Powell threw petrol on the flames, yeah?
100% threw petrol on the flame, and somebody as learned as him knows what they're doing. As you've already said, he knew what he was doing, and I don't believe for a second you would come out with stuff like that if you don't have some of those thoughts within you as well. So all of this thing of it's just regurgitating what other people had been saying is that's like just a way to kind of move the shift away from who he is really, and etc. So I know you've had a good experience with him, you drove for him, etc., and I've got no doubt that he was a really nice person and all of these things, but people have agendas, people have their true thoughts and feelings, and if you need to mask it by saying this is what people say rather than saying this is what I believe, that's what you do, and that's what a wise man would do.
Yeah, John.
And so I respect him for his wisdom, for not putting it fully on himself and putting it on the people that he spoke to. That was very smart of Enoch, but I find it very difficult and I find it hard to listen to, say, for instance, Asian people saying, oh, he wasn't racist. If he was saying, be careful of Jewish people, be careful of Asian people, this would be a totally different conversation. He said, be careful of black people. And that's the problem. It's very specific.
Okay, no, John, I think, for a first-time caller, you've made your point extremely well. And thank you. Thank you for calling. Actually, on the Asian stuff, I do remember an interview when he was asked a question. He said, well, you love India, Enoch. I mean, what's the problem with people coming to this country? To which he replied, yes, I love India, but I've no desire to see Birmingham turned into India. So actually, he was very, very nervous about large-scale immigration from different cultures. That was at the heart of it, but I can quite easily see that this language would have led to greater tensions. Tim is calling from Hatfield. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Nigel. Nice to speak to you. Hello. There's a dissonance here because what the actual choice of words Enoch Powell used, I absolutely condone. To isolate black, not condone. Sorry, to say.
I just wanted to check, Tim, but okay, let's go with condemn, not condone.
No. It was disgusting the way he isolated the black community, and I totally disagree with that choice of words. But I understand what he was trying to say. He was not identifying a colour. He was identifying a culture. Let's go back to Britain in the 1960s. It was a very different nation. I'm the son of an immigrant. My mother's from Finland, my father's British. She said when she arrived in the 50s, this was a beautiful country. Sunday, everyone went to church. It was a very Christian nation. And Powell, which a lot of the callers haven't mentioned, was a devout Christian.
Oh, profound Christian, absolutely, yes.
Profound.
Yeah.
And what he feared, and I understand this, was not colour. And I have black, Asian, whatever, this is not what he was driving about. He was saying, our identity is Judeo-Christian. Our laws are based on Judeo-Christianity. Our history, thousands of years of history, is based on that. Our civilization that we took to the world is based on that. What he feared was what he saw in India when the partition happened, that he saw a clash of cultures. And let me correct what's her name, Alibi Brown, where she said it was the British who caused it. Let me put that lady straight, who is actually a more devout racist than Powell, because it was actually Jinnah who said Islam cannot coexist with other religions. And that was the reason for the partition of Pakistan. That was why Britain had to, appease Jinnah, who said we cannot mix. We cannot have a nation where Islam is mixing with other cultures. And Powell saw that. 50 years later, look at our nation. Very few people go to church. Very few people go to church. People do not understand the Queen is the head of the church. Our civilization, our history, the Reformation is based on the Bible. But what we're doing, particularly accelerated under Blair, was creating a homogenized one nation, one culture. And the problem is, Nigel, the rights are freedoms we take for granted. But if you go to an Islamic country, you go to, say, India, where there's a terrible caste system, we just accept this as normal, but it is based on a Judeo-Christian principle.
No, and Tim, there are parts of our cities. There are parts of our cities today that are separated off, not integrated with the rest of the community that live in that city. And I've seen streets in places in the north of England where English is not spoken, and these are the kind of divisions and tensions that exist between the white working class and migrant groups. They're the kinds of things that Powell was talking and warning about, but he did it in such a way that it made it very difficult for anybody else to have a proper conversation about it. I'd love to phone you, Nigel, but I'm in a Land Rover looking at tigers in a safari park. Powell was the greatest Prime Minister we never had. I keep hearing he was a clever man. Well, he must have been a very clever man with no common sense. Apart from delivering a nonsensical, inflammatory speech, he was completely wrong. And the common sense point, Les, is a good one. I think what this speech showed was bad judgment. Because why would somebody who was trying to become the Prime Minister give a speech that led to him being cast out of the political establishment? He was brilliant in many ways, and a deep Christian, as Tim just said. In fact, that particular day that I'd driven him back from Newbury, I asked him, what are you working on at the moment? And he said, I'm rewriting the New Testament. Only from Powell. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 11:45. It's London Marathon Day, and it's hot. It's the hottest it's ever been for the London Marathon. We're going to go back. We had a few gremlins on the line. Let's go back to Chris Gold's down at Tower Bridge. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Nigel. Well, yes, as I suppose you can hear, 40,000 runners have set off on this 26.2 mile route amid warnings that temperatures could hit, as you say, 24 degrees. The hottest marathon previously was back in 2007, where 22.6 was recorded at St James's Park, and there were some issues there. One runner died after collapsing during the race, and 73 had to go to hospital. Obviously, organisers don't want the same again today.
Sure.
So they've said there's plenty of water, there's lots of shower stations, there's a lot of ice on standby, and that those who are running should attempt to reduce how much time they want to beat their record by. Now, the Met Office said that it would actually feel hotter on the course because of the warmth from the tarmac and from other people. I'm standing right in the middle of Tower Bridge. It's absolutely beautiful. Blue skies. I was here this time last year and I was absolutely freezing. Totally different story.
And it sounds,
today.
I mean, the noise, Chris, sounds extraordinary.
It is. There's so many supporters here from so many charities just supporting people who are running the marathon, and people who've spoken to me who've run it before said that's what makes the London Marathon, the supporters, the fact that it's on the iconic route running 26.2 miles through London. And this part of the route is actually pretty tough. It's mile 12 at Tower Bridge, and they have to go up a 20-metre elevation to go to this point, one of the few elevations of the route. And instead of turning left and going down towards the Mall, which is what you want to do naturally, they've actually got to go right and run all the way down to Canary Wharf. So another 14 miles to go after this point, and I can see on their faces it's pretty tough going already. Just in terms of what's happened with the race already, the Queen pressed the button at the grounds of Windsor Castle. Britain's David Weir has won his 8th London Marathon title, winning the men's wheelchair race, and 4-time Olympic champion Sir Mo Farah. He's hoping to beat his 2014 time of 2 hours, 8 minutes and 21 seconds.
Terrific. Chris, thank you very much. Enjoy the party. Well, I have to say, the noise down there just sounds completely extraordinary. Back to Enoch Powell, 50 years on, what that speech means to you. Was he right? Was he wrong? Monica is calling from Southend-on-Sea. Good morning.
Hello. Admire you very much. I'm black. My parents came from the Windrush.
Yep.
I've got half and half. So I was born over here. I became very successful as vice president of brokers, whatever. And but I sort of understood what you were trying to say. Enoch Powell and you were not saying the same thing, I'm afraid. I don't see you as racist. I see him as racist. And I just want to correct the other chap who said that what Enoch Powell was worried about was the fact that it was a devout Christian country and that the Queen and everyone on the Windrush was devout Christian.
They were. No, that's true. That is absolutely true.
And even now, even in all these countries, they adore the Queen. They adore the British Empire. They're actually in those countries naming places after them. So it wasn't a fact of coming over, because I understand that. It wasn't a fact of coming over and changing all. They might have spoken a different accent, the same language. They might have eaten different food, but they weren't trying to smother, like nowadays, what was going to smother your beliefs or anything. They were very. My mum and dad said, well, keep your head down if someone. That was the attitude then. I know it's different now, but what I'm saying to you is that guy did us, my parents, a great disservice by saying what he said, because it's just not true. There was no one that I knew who came over that wasn't Christian.
Yeah, no. I think
and went to church.
What he'd seen, Monica. What he'd seen, of course, in India with partition. Was Hindus, turning against Muslims and vice versa. That was the religious war that he'd seen. And I think I'm right in saying that in the year of partition, about 1 million people died on that border. So it was pretty horrendous what happened in 47, 48 in India.
What I'm saying to you is, what seems to be happening, this discussion I'm quite pleased with, it had to be had, so don't get me wrong. But what I'm seeing is, they're trying to lump everyone together, and you can't do that nowadays. There's a lot of different groups like in every country. Yeah. The Indians are different. They're very strong about their religion, which is totally different from the British religion. I'm not criticising them. It's not my place. I'm just saying you cannot just lump all immigrants together.
No,
actually, the Windrush people, they came over with intention. You saw where they came down. They had suits on. They had lovely dresses on.
Absolutely.
They wanted to integrate into...
And some of their kids, Monica, some of their kids have now found they haven't got British passports and they're not welcome.
It could have been me, and I've got a degree. But I am 60-odd.
Well, it could have been you, Monica, because that's about the age of people that are appearing and not wanted anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And when I heard, my heart, because there were 7 of us, 3 born in this country, so we had our passports, and my brothers and one sister, 4 not. They've got all theirs, but only because we were educated in a certain way. Now, why is it because someone hasn't been, they should be penalised? I do think, my heart hurts, because except the time when I voted UKIP, I vote Tories all my, the whole time, because I like the idea of people got work. You come over here, you got work, you've got to try and respect the country you come into. That's not racism, so don't get me wrong, but sadly, people, I was surprised how little people know about the Caribbean people. They try and rope them in with Africans. You can't, because you can't rope them. The Asians are never going to necessarily support us because they're from a different. They're not going to be picked on at the same time we are for the same reasons. They don't see themselves above us.
Some of this gets a bit complex, Monica, but overall, you feel Pal did a great disservice to your parents, yeah?
But I do think they've got to keep an hold on immigration. I totally agree, because I don't want to pay for everyone. And Tom, Dick and Harry's not working, and Christ knows what. People who work hard, you've got to, whatever colour. But the sad thing about this government is they can't get out the East Europeans. Not that I think they should be checking and letting people in, and they should. So what they've done is they've chosen blacks and chosen people who are legal.
Well, this is because of the open door to Europe, we decided to crack down elsewhere. Monica, one thing for certain is whatever language we use today, and it may be very different from 50 years ago, but the arguments over immigration, numbers and integration are just as important as they were back in 1968. Let's go to Peter, who's calling from Sunningdale. Good morning, Peter.
Oh, good morning, Nigel. Yes, I think I'll put another slant on this, that many of the problems that we have today really stem right back to the 60s. I worked in the House of Parliament from the 64 to 1980. I saw the Enoch Powell situation and everything else, and when I put it forward, because my wife's French, I put it forward that, why can't we have identity cards? The Mandarins there said, good God, man, you don't know much about politics. No British government will ever vote for identity cards. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, numbers, dear boy, numbers. Nobody in the government, or even in the sort of parliamentary side, want to know exactly how many people in the country. And, of course, if you've got identity cards, you would and that would have avoided all these problems with the Windrush situation, because they'd have all had identity cards and would have all been able to have a peaceful...
that's the first person I've heard this week make that point. I've actually, Peter, not been in favour of ID cards, because I don't like the concept of sort of being stopped in Bromley High Street and asked to produce my papers. But yes, Windrush would have been completely avoided with identity cards. You are right about that. When you worked in the House of, in the Houses of Parliament, I mean, what sort of a figure was Powell?
Very highly rated. I mean, we talked about T.C. Heathy, who got rid of him, but that was a very bad thing. I think, unfortunately, there was a lot of misnomers at that time. A very fragile situation with people because of the immigration situation. People got inflated in all sorts of directions, and you could have left or right. It didn't matter. Everybody was against the situation. The moment that it was an explosion waiting to happen, if you know what I mean, and unfortunately, Enoch pressed the button and off it went. And perhaps we're not able now to, well, we're starting to talk more about it because of people like yourself who are able to sort of talk about it. But I think one of the things I would say is that you've said for many years that up until the sort of 90s we had approximately 30,000.
That's right. 30,000 people a year went to 300,000 a year, Peter.
Now, that should be emphasised every time anybody talks. They must emphasise that, because unfortunately people seem to forget that they talk about we've had immigration for many years, which we have, but we haven't had them at this volume.
No, and when Powell spoke, the number had gone up to 50,000 and looked like increasing. And in fact, it was Mrs. Thatcher who brought some very strict immigration rules in that brought the numbers right back down in the 70s. But listen, thank you, Peter. I've got time for one last call. First time caller to the show, Francesca from Holland Park. Good morning.
Good morning, Matt. Hi. Just a small point. When I was at university 10 years ago, they said I needed to translate Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War, and which was between Athens and Sparta. But obviously all speaking Greek, and I couldn't translate the Greek very well. So the teacher said, "Go and look at Enoch Powell's notes on the Peloponnesian War." And of course, he was a genius. And the way he dissects language, and everyone's talked today about how violent his language was. Greek is a very visual language, and that's how the Greeks spoke of their ideas in images. And
That's a very interesting point, Francesca. Very interesting point. And he was, and Francesca, we're out of time, I'm sorry, thank you, but a very interesting point you make. And he was, intelligence-wise, he said on the Parkinson show, he said he'd never met his intellectual equal. So he was an extraordinary figure, but it was a very divisive speech, and it did, I think, do a lot of damage. The words were not the right ones. You've been listening to The Nigel Farrow Show here on LBC. I'm back tomorrow night at 7. At 3 this afternoon, it's Andrew Castle, but up next, it's Ian Payne.
Thank you, Nigel.